Welcome back to the new Frontline. My name is Siena Rose, and in this episode, we are discussing the Defense of Freedom Institute's brand new report, The Fall of Woke. If you are unfamiliar with their work, the Defense of Freedom Institute, or DFI, is a nonprofit organization that's focused on creating thoughtful, conservative solutions to the challenges that threaten our world, specifically in the areas of education, workforce, labor, and employment policy. Joining the podcast today is DFI's Director of Media Outreach and Spokesperson, Angela Morabito, and Senior Counsel on Policy and Regulatory, Paul Zimmerman. Together, we're going to discuss how the two largest teachers' unions in the country are soldiering on in a pursuit of radical and damaging ideologies, the cultural fallout of all this insanity, and the messaging that these two out-of-touch union leaders are sending. Stay tuned. Angela and Paul, welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad to have you on the new Frontline here.
Thanks, Siena. It's great to be with you.
Thanks, Siena. Great to be here.
So your report, The Fall of Woke, is an awesome, truly a masterclass in looking into what teachers' unions are doing in their insanity and their woke ideology and the radicalness that we've seen bombard the news recently. And it starts out with mentioning about over a dozen executive orders that President Trump has issued in response to these woke issues. I'm curious, how have y'all seen the public awareness and perception of these issues change as President Trump has gone about targeting them?
I think if you flash back to about a year ago, we all thought woke was on the way out. And we might be right still, but you see President Trump elected back into office. You see this flurry of executive orders that come out early in his second term. It looks like woke is dead on arrival. You also see the shift with young people really starting to oppose woke ideology. And I get this question all the time of, well, why the change with young people? And my answer is because they've lived it. These are people who dealt with the school closures that were prolonged by the teacher unions for far longer than necessary. These are people who grew up with CRT and DEI dictating what went on in their classrooms. They've lived through it. They hate it. They don't want any more. But instead of taking their cues from public opinion or what would help students and teachers, these teacher union bosses are doubling down on the same ideology that's put them in retreat in the first place.
Yeah, Paul, would you agree with that? Do you have anything to add?
Yes, I completely agree with it. And I think Angela strikes a great point about the young people rejecting this ideology. I think it's kind of an emperor's new clothes phenomenon where these young people just walk on the scene and they start realizing, these woke mandates, these DEI initiatives, separating people out by race is just completely ridiculous. They're coming at it with fresh eyes. And so I think that they are starting to realize that, this is not healthy for society. And I really would say that the executive orders issued by President Trump are a reflection of this kind of reaction to woke politics and ideology that the American electorate has been experiencing, and that President Trump kind of rode into office on January 20th. So I think they are really a reflection and a reaction to the kind of politics of the moment and a rejection of progressive radical leftist ideology.
Yeah, and then in the report, it also mentions another reflection of that shift. 47% of that 18 to 29-year-old demographic of voters shifted to voting for President Trump, which you said, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the first time in 20 years that a Republican has cracked that demographic of going over 40%. That's incredible, and I think it is a really indicative shift of what's happening. I know I have some personal anecdotes, and I'm sure you guys do as well, but the older generation we're seeing is a little bit more stubborn and not wanting to let go of these DEI values, where the younger generation is a little bit more willing to admit wrong. And I mean, would you guys agree? I think that's a really interesting shift we're seeing happening in our culture.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think you see it within the teacher unions themselves, right? You have these people at the top who have been embedded in the union bubble for a long time, who are all in on, we're going to use our schools to teach racial justice and climate justice and social justice. And then you have rank and file teachers who are showing up, especially new teachers, who are going, wait, these kids can't read. They can't do math. Why aren't we focusing on that? So there's a big split that's been emerging now for several years between what union bosses want and what they set their sights on versus what actual teachers need to be effective in the classroom.
When do you think that shift started between union bosses not really being able to reflect what teachers wanted, what teachers actually want in the classroom right now?
Maybe Paul could give us the more of the history here, but I would say it's been brewing for a while. I think COVID dumped gasoline on that fire. Paul, would you say the same? You might have a better perspective than I do.
Yeah, I would say COVID had to do with it, but I think we're looking at a broader picture of the union bosses thrive on these kinds of these privileges that they've gotten from the government over the years. I think that they have latched on to the kind of spoils system that has flourished under the current Department of Education, uh, or its immediately past iteration since 1980. And they really kind of need uh, government privileges and one-upmanship in order to help them exist. So these teacher union bosses recognize that this is the hand that feeds them. Whereas I think some of the newer teachers recognize, hey, these kids are not learning. This system is actually not contributing to a vibrant education system. It's really just contributing to the more senior people within these unions, the teacher union bosses at the top, um, uh, getting benefits from the system.
Yeah, our CEO Aaron With often likes to say like the bigger slice, they want a bigger slice of pie because that means the bigger slice, or a bigger pie as a whole because that means the bigger slice than they can get. And I think that's true. And then looking at your report, kind of what cracked me up when reading it is that these insane examples of what the teachers unions have been doing have primarily come from the past couple of years. I feel like there's been a huge shift, especially since COVID. There's the ones that come to mind are the No Kings protests and then the NEA's insane 2025 handbook that they released. Was there any single event that either prompted you to write this report and dig into it, or that you feel has been like the biggest highlight or low light as the teachers unions have continued to push for wokeness?
I just mentioned that we've been researching the kind of wacky and harmful actions of unions especially at their summer meetings over the past 3 years. Uh, and so we've seen a lot of lowlights from the unions. We've seen a lot of these radical left just totally out of touch with mainstream resolutions. This year, I mean, I think you have to put near the top of the list the National Education Association, the NEA's promotion of radical anti-Semitic ideology. I think it's really scary when Jewish delegates to the NEA's representative assembly go to their summer meetings and feel like they've been bullied, harassed, laughed at for bringing up pro-Israel issues, or even just talking about terrorism against Jewish people in the United States. And when the NEA, publishes its handbook online to millions of members, and includes materials about the Holocaust that exclude any mention of the Jewish people. So I mean that topped it for me, and I think that's really scary when we come to a moment like that with the NEA and other unions.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's a low point for the unions. And whenever they get caught with this horrible anti-Semitism, they try and backtrack and say, oh, we didn't mean it. But all their mistakes only seem to go in one direction, and it's a hateful and scary direction. On a bit of a lighter note, I was personally struck by in their handbook where they said we're going to at every turn we're going to call President Trump a fascist, and they misspelled fascism. Like, guys, you can't spell. Why are we letting you guys have control over the schools ever, anywhere? And yet you see these districts that are totally captured by the unions, that what the union wants, the union gets, because that's where political power lies. So with mistakes big and small, I think it's important for parents and teachers to know Unions aren't really there for parents and students. They're also not there for teachers. They are political entities that exist for more money and more power for themselves.
Definitely. I feel like your report does a really wonderful job at highlighting that and then following up with all of these exact examples of that exact thing. Some particular things I wanted to highlight were on page 4, it talks about the anti-ICE protests that teachers' unions are participating in at varying levels of insanity. And I feel like the argument that I hear sometimes in defense of that is that people who have power and notoriety should comment on things that are of importance, subjective importance to them. But what do you think it says about the internal true motivations of these unions that they're spending time doing that instead of, developing teaching materials that actually teach our children how to read and do math?
Yeah, they don't care about the rule of law, and they're willing to try and stand in the way if it means their enrollment numbers go up. They get more money. They get to have schools hire more teachers, more staff members. It's always more, more, more. Those are more people where they can take money out of their paychecks to increase and fill up the union coffers. I think that's the long and the short of it. And Paul, you've seen so many great examples of this. I don't want to cut you off if there's more you want to add.
Well, I would just point to some of Angela's research on how schools are just failing. Uh, why talk about public schools and what's going on in the public schools when you're a union, when you know that that's a losing issue for you, that you know that people want to leave these schools and they want to seek better options using whether it's a scholarship tax credit that just got passed in Congress, or whether it's a state-based education freedom program. The unions are losing on these issues. And so, of course, just talk about immigration, talk about progressive topics of the day, and talk about more and more and more money that should go to fund your political programs. So I think that's what the unions are really doing. They're trying to distract from the issue that our children are not learning and they're not all right, and instead just talk about immigration and ICE and things that they think can get the next generation on board with their radical agenda.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's interesting to see how unions play the social justice card over and over and over again to try and get notoriety. I mean, the other unions that come to mind are the Chicago Teachers Union in Chicago and Stacey Davis Gates. She will comment on nearly everything under the sun if she thinks it's going to get her more notoriety.
Yeah, these people can't defend their results. They know they can't defend the test scores coming out of public schools. They can't defend the fact that their schools are graduating kids who cannot read the diplomas they're being handed. So instead, they have to jump at the next shiny object, anything that they think will get them sympathetic attention, because their actual job performance is not going to do it.
And Stacey Davis Gates is a good example of deflection, especially because I think one of the key roles of public schools, in fact, their most important role, is to keep children safe during the school day and right before school and after school. That's not happening in Chicago public schools these days. Very, very sadly, children are being subjected to gun violence increasingly in these schools. And other types of violence, and they're not safe. And the teachers union's solution to this is not to restore some kind of law and order. It's to practice restorative justice. It's to kind of try to understand why, what is going on in the psychology of the crime that's happening. It's not to actually stop the crime and keep kids safe. It's to kind of double down on radical progressivism and wokeism in schools.
Precisely. Yeah, you mentioned, like we talked about, like the NEA and their one of their meetings that they had. On page 6 of your report, it also talks about the relationship between teachers unions and the insane amount of anti-Semitism that is upcoming in our culture right now. And then the NEA handbook that was leaked, I believe originally by Corey DeAngelis, that really set that story on fire. That decision of the NEA to really erase, and as you said earlier, Paul, and really discount and not mention the Jews as part of like a real victim of the Holocaust, that decision, I feel like, marked a really big departure on what unions have gone so far to comment on and what this new precedent that they're setting. What did y'all think about that when you first saw it? And what precedent do you think this further sets in the NEA choosing to do that?
Yeah, I think it's a sign of rot within progressive and radical left culture, and that has kind of infected the teacher unions. It shows a really troubling rising anti-Semitism in the teacher unions. We published a report recently on that called "Breaking Solidarity," and what's really interesting about this topic is how much the unions, trade unions in general, and teacher unions specifically, over the years, up to 50 years ago, were staunch allies of Israel. That they defended their teachers against anti-Semitic attacks. They were really champions. Whatever else we think about them in that era, I do think that they looked after their members who were Jewish, and they believed in Israel and found allies in Israel. Fast forward to today, and I think that they've abandoned their Jewish colleagues who for whom Israel holds a really central place in their religious identity. I think that they have thrown in their lot with the kind of Mamdani left, globalize the Antipada folks. I think this is for a number of reasons that we can talk about, but I think seeking radicals from really, a younger generation, and students who are being taught in schools that Israel is the enemy and as a colonialist oppressor. I think that's some of the reasons for it, but they've really plumbed the depths and hitting a new low and not protecting their Jewish members, in just attacking Israel at every turn, and really just abandoning the people in their unions who just want to teach and who don't want to be helping fund this radical messaging. I think that they have just left those people behind, and they've just totally forgotten how to calibrate their message toward the American mainstream.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. You look at the content they're pushing out toward their members, a map that literally erases Israel and calls that land Palestine, content that spread evil lies about the Holocaust. This is misinformation. It is being spread by the union to its 3 million members. Meanwhile, there are plenty of great resources out there about the Second World War, the history of the Middle East, education about the Holocaust. Thankfully, we live in a world where you don't have to look very far if you want to teach that well. So when you see a union purposefully spreading these horrible, horrible lies to a very broad audience of people who reach students in classrooms every day, you know it's intentional. This isn't just a one-off mistake. It keeps happening, and it keeps happening in a direction that is blatantly anti-Semitic and blatantly ahistorical.
Yeah, Paul, you mentioned the word rot in your response, and I think that's entirely spot on. How do you guys see the moral targeting of these unions coming through, partially in this anti-Semitic rhetoric that we're seeing happen? But would you agree that a lot of this feels like it's targeting the rhetoric or the morals and the empathy and our care for one human to another, that the unions are targeting that because it helps further their cause?
I think so. I mean, it's much bigger than just one issue, right? You look at what the unions do on gender, and they always say we have to be inclusive. Okay, well, if you're inclusive of transgender athletes by allowing them to compete as women, you are exclusive of women who want and deserve a level playing field. Unions will always couch what they're doing in this language of kindness, wokeness, empathy, and all you have to do is scratch the surface to realize that's not what it's about. That climate justice is about controlling people's behavior. Racial justice is DEI with a better name slapped over it. These are not moral initiatives, and yet they try to claim this moral high ground based on what? Based on nothing. It is all spin from the unions. So that's part of what our report hopes to accomplish, is informing parents, taxpayers, and especially teachers who have money taken out of their paychecks in many cases to fund their union dues. They might not know what they're funding, and they also might not agree with what they're funding. So the more they know, I think the better equipped everyone is to make their own decisions rather than having unions decide for them from the top down.
I think that any teacher who is a member of one of these national unions, I think that most of them would be shocked by many of these messages that they are unwittingly supporting with their dues. And I think part of our philosophy is to try to expose those views to the average teacher and make sure that teachers know what they're funding and know what they're supporting. And if they don't want to support it anymore, they should vote with their feet and they should quit their union. And what worries me in talking about this moral rot in the unions is I think what attracts a lot of the radical left element, far beyond the mainstream of either party to the unions, especially the teacher unions, is one, the money. They get a never-ending supply of teacher union dues as long as teachers are actually members of the unions and don't quit. They have a steady supply of income, hundreds of millions of dollars that they can use. And by the way, just as an aside, they use far more money to support their political messaging than to actually representing the people in their union, which Sienna, and which the Freedom Foundation has done a wonderful job of pointing out over the years. But two, I think they're even more concerning is the reason that these teachers who are graduating kind of radicalized in these teaching schools or in the universities, they're attracted to the unions in order to influence the next generation, in order to actually bring young minds into their fold, to turn them against the West, to turn them against the institutions, white supremacist institutions, so to speak. So it's a little worrying when I think one of their key goals is indoctrination, and they have like a limitless supply of resources to do so.
Very well said. Another part of that comes to mind too is with this indoctrination is and all their resources is that they are really good at pushing the narrative of like no matter what you're always oppressed, and I say that I know exactly that you guys know exactly what I'm talking about, and they promote fight the man and the working class against it's us or them all the time. And another reflection of that is on page 9 of your report. The NEA dedicated $200,000 to representing teachers who were teaching things that was directly against the Supreme Court ruling, which is insane. What do you think? What message does it send when we see union leaders like Becky Pringle and Randy Weingarten dedicate and outwardly say that they're going to defy Supreme Court rulings and orders from President Trump in their agenda, in their furthering of the agenda of wokeness?
Well, the union bosses who are doing this do not respect the rule of law. They do not respect parental rights. This was added to the union game plan in the wake of the decision in Mahmoud v. Taylor. The Defense of Freedom Institute filed an amicus brief in this case, and it's all about whether or not parents should be allowed to opt their children out of sexually explicit lessons. Fortunately, the Supreme Court said yes, that parents have the right to direct the upbringing of their children. And if you, mom and dad, don't like the book that's being referenced in English class, you have the right to say, no, my child doesn't need to sit through that. Thanks, but no thanks. One of the unions didn't like this very much, and they said, if you want to teach LGBTQ books, we don't care who objects. We will create a pretty healthy sized fund to help you avoid accountability as a teacher. That to me says everything you need to know about these unions.
Yeah, and I think that when you look at the unions and the Supreme Court over the past few years, I mean, the unions have never pulled their punches when it comes to the courts, and essentially characterizing the courts as illegitimate, conservative institutions that are just spreading a political rulings. They have no shame when it comes to that, and I think this instance of talking about Mahmoud, I think it just goes to show that they think that they can outlast the current moment at the Supreme Court and the current Roberts Court's direction in favor of parental rights and people actually knowing what's happening with their kids in schools. And this is the general idea of our report, I think, is to say that woke is on the run at the moment. Woke is under siege, but these unions are thinking that they can outlast that moment, that they can convince a future cohort, that they can look 5 or 10 years down the road and make changes. And as long as they kind of keep that message alive, and as long as they keep on kind of spouting this DEI messaging.
Very true. So, with that in mind, what do you think parents and lawmakers should be aware of and looking forward for in the next year as unions continue with that idea that they think they can outlast what's happening and outlast the changes that are being made?
I think the most important takeaway for anybody from this report is that teacher unions do not represent teachers, and they do not care about what is in the best interest of student learning. I mean, I hesitate to even call it teacher unions at some point because they are lobbying groups. Paul mentioned it earlier that they spend far more money on lobbying politically than they do actually representing their teacher members. So I think, as the saying goes, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And the more people understand about what these unions really do, who they really are, and what they're really trying to accomplish with schools as the vehicle, schools are a means to an end for them, the better off our society is going to be, and the less of a stronghold unions will have over schools.
And I think we're looking at an election year next year, and I think the union bosses are going to come out in droves, and I think they're going to be very open in their messaging and critical of the mainstream political viewpoints and kind of classic Western principles like merit and faith and the fact that non-discrimination, not focusing on the color of people's skin. So I think that they are going to kind of expose themselves more and more on these DEI points, and it's going to offer an opportunity for people who disagree with them to just point this out. So I think we all need to be on the lookout for them not being careful about what they say, and we need to inform members of these unions and the rest of the public about, do you really want these people in control of your public schools? Do you want them to be controlling the education that your children receive each day?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And another point that comes to mind to that is when you mentioned earlier in this interview and in the report, you called what the unions are siding with now the Mamdani left. And we see, Zohar Mamdani was backed by teachers' unions. And so he's like the newest socialist darling that's coming up for the Democrat Party. Can you explain maybe more what you mean by like the Mamdani left, though, in that quote, and particularly what side of that unions are going to be pushing more into? And you just mentioned it a little bit, but I'd love for you to expand.
When we use that term, I understand it to mean, the Mamdani wing of the Democratic Party, really a socialist bent, obviously a democratic socialist of America point of view. And at the base of that is that the government has to be responsible for solving all of the problems of society. We see when we start talking about growing government and the government as the solution, we start seeing why the unions are advancing that message more and more. Because as the government grows and as it's less about individual spirit and individual merit, I think the unions latch on to more government benefits, more handouts to their organization, and so you can kind of see why they like Mamdani, why they have sided with these things. Of course, it's more than just about growing government, and it's really about, as you said earlier, Siena, oppressed versus oppressor, that kind of view of society. People don't just get ahead on the basis of their own talents and working hard, but they do it by nature of the color of their skin or their sex. And other characteristics. And so that's really what I'm referring to. It's really, grow the government because, you can't actually leave people to their own devices. And Angela may have an opinion on that interpretation of the Mamdani left.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think the core message of the Mamdani left is you will depend on government for everything. You won't do anything independently. That is a really appealing message for the teacher unions because they want schools to run more and more parts of people's lives. You'll hear them talk about community schools. I would argue it's not a community school if it fails to teach people to read, write, and do math. But what they try to do in places with a lot of union control is say, your meals are going to come from your school, your housing voucher, public assistance is going to come from the school. They even want families to get medical care at the school. So it's this game of how dependent can we make you? Because the more dependent we make you, the more powerful the unions become.
Yeah, it's a frightening trend that we're seeing happening. I can't imagine supporting something that would tell me that I can't do anything and I can't be left to my own devices. So it's incredible that this is what unions are pushing, and even more incredible that so many people are believing it and not questioning it. I think that's another thing that unions are probably pushing: the lack of like following up with your own questions and coming to your own conclusions.
I think people thankfully are questioning it. I think the election of President Trump shows people are questioning the unbridled growth of government, and DEI, gender ideology, and the ability of public schools to solve all of our problems, especially since this administration has pushed school choice wherever it can. And I think it's been a great champion of school choice. I think what we have to hang on to is that woke is not dead. We need to keep on pushing this because politics, in my view, is often a reaction to things that happen each cycle, each media cycle, each election. We need to keep on exposing what the unions are saying and what the unions are trying to accomplish in order to be successful, and not let them win in just like kind of riding out the current opposition to their policies.
Well, in conclusion, you kind of brought up of like what next steps must be taken to ensure that wokeness, it is dying, but it's not exactly dead yet. What other steps must be taken to ensure that it doesn't have a sudden resurgence? You mentioned there's an election year coming up next year that union leaders are going to come out of the woodwork to try and have a say in. What can we be on the lookout for? And what would you recommend? I know a lot of this is just education, which is another primary goal of your report and a primary goal of the Freedom Foundation. But what else would you recommend that people look at?
I think one of the biggest things is to look at who's standing in the way of education freedom. This is the closest thing we have to a consensus issue in the United States, across party lines, across demographic lines. The overwhelming majority of Americans support allowing parents to choose their children's school. The unions fight tooth and nail against it at every turn. And we even mentioned in our Fall of Woke report that they have been working overtime, lying about what this new federal K-12 tax credit scholarship means. They say, oh, it's robbing our public schools. No, it doesn't take a penny away from public schools. But they are terrified of families having options. And I think the more people get informed about why they're so scared, it's because they depend on a monopoly, because they cannot defend the results of their product, which is kids who can't read, write, and do math. To me, it all comes back to that.
Yeah, we really can't let up on our messaging about the bad job that these teacher union bosses are doing with our public education system. We have to recognize that the federal government has done a lot under the president to dismantle some of these DEI programs, to enforce our laws against illegal immigration, and kind of to restore sanity. But it really has to, the effort has to continue. It can't just be a flash in the pan. We really need to soldier on and realize that these issues are not fixed. And we need to pay attention to what the unions are saying and what kind of messaging they're using, because if they're successful and we allow them to be successful, then what Angela is talking about, I mean, the failing public schools, that's just going to become permanent. And we need to ride the successes of our allies, and try to further the scholarship tax credit, try to further school choice initiatives, in order to help children learn and restore our education system to one that actually teaches kids.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining me on the podcast today and taking time to tell me about the report. Are there any other things that you would love to highlight to a listener who maybe hasn't had the chance to read it yet?
Thank you so much, Sienna. I would recommend to anybody just check out the report. It's on dfipolicy.org. Or on our social media, we push out lots of Mythbusters graphics about quick hits dispelling myths perpetuated by unions and their allies. And we are at DFI Policy on all major social media platforms.
Awesome. Paul, do you have any social media you'd like to plug?
No, just DFIs. Just check out the great work that Angela and our team are doing. I think I would also point to our strike map, which shows places across the country where the teacher union bosses have imposed themselves in strikes and tried to take teachers off the job rather than actually teach kids and keep them out of school. So I think that's an important resource for your audience in the years ahead.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much for joining me.